Welcome to the Prospective Doctor Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Pre-med and medical students alike are encouraged to tune in each week for tips on how to become a strong med school candidate, gain acceptance into the school of your dreams, and succeed on your journey toward residency and becoming a doctor.
Welcome back. This is Chase DeMarco from the Medical Nemesis Podcast, filling in again. And today I'm joined by Dr. Cory Fawcett. Cory, how are you doing today?
Hey, very good. Chase, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us. We have a lot of interesting material to talk about here because not only are you a private practice general surgeon, you're the author of several award-winning books related to doctors' guides, so to speak, such as The Doctor's Guide to Starting Your Practice Right and The Doctor's Guide to Eliminating Debt, as well as others. So you have a lot of guidance for doctors and, in this case, future doctors.
I'm actually not practicing anymore. Retired from my practice not long ago. And I decided that in my second half of my life, what I wanted to do instead of treat patients was help doctors improve their position financially and have a better life at home. And that starts clear back in medical school. So I took a new path. I don't consider myself retired. I consider myself repurposed. And now I have a new mission.
I like it. I didn't realize that you're no longer practicing, but congratulations on the semi-retirement / alteration of direction.
Yeah, some of the internet police don't think I've retired because if you're still writing books or you're doing podcasts, they think, hey, you're still working. What are you talking about? But this is a completely different way of life, completely different job than taking call, covering emergencies, doing surgery, and working in the middle of the night. So it feels retired, even though I still have something to do. It's nice to have a purpose in life.
Agreed. There's nothing more fun than creating content, in my opinion.
Yeah, I really like that. I would have never thought, if you asked me 10 years ago, would I ever write a single book? I would have said, are you kidding? I don't write. But here I am having, I just published last month my 5th book in this series with 2 more coming down the pike currently. So you never know what the future holds for you.
And your books are very popular in the physician community. It might not be as known in the medical student community because they haven't quite reached that point where they're thinking about certain things like their finances and starting a practice. But these are also topics that are very relevant to student plans going forward and some topics that they should really know a little bit more about and some resources to utilize in the future. So I'm glad you're here to discuss these for the audience.
If I think back to my time in medical school, I can't really remember that I was up to reading some book that wasn't required by my current course. I remember there was so much reading that I needed to do just to keep my head above water in what I was currently learning that there wasn't really a lot of time for me to read something else. So I can see why most of the medical students haven't discovered other books besides what they're currently working on. So the Starting Your Practice book is a book that's really designed for the last year of your residency so that when it's time for you to branch out and become attending, and you'll be practicing medicine now, that you'll get the right start as you begin to practice the real thing. No longer under somebody else's wing, but the buck stops with you. And whether you're employed or running a private practice, you're still going to be practicing medicine. And I wrote that to help these young guys get the right start when they get into that. That was a lot of fun to do. Unfortunately, most of those guys won't read the book because they don't read anything outside of what they're trying to learn right now. They'll read it when they become an attending and have a little bit more free time, but then it'll be too late. So I don't know how to solve that.
Maybe that's a great reason to have you on the podcast because students can digest a podcast a little bit easier than a book that's not on the curriculum. So we can discuss some of the...
And they can listen to it when they're driving into work.
Exactly.
Or something,
So let's start discussing some of these topics then. And I think one of them is really just the budgeting concerns for students. Since you're not making money, you're getting into a lot of student debt, you still have your normal living expenses. Are there some suggestions, some recommendations that you would give to pre-meds as they're about to enter this phase, or even medical students that they're currently going through this phase in their life?
It's interesting when you bring up the topic of budgeting. No matter what phase in life you are in, everybody has an excuse to not budget. So when you talk to somebody like in the medical school era, they say, well, I don't have any income, so I don't need to budget. And then you talk to somebody in the resident era, now they've got a job and an income, and they say, well, I don't have enough time to budget. And then you become an attending, and now you got money and time, and they say, well, I make too much money to worry about budgeting. And so everybody has their excuse why they don't have to pay attention to their money inflow and outflow. But I think it's probably the most important for a student to do it of all three of those people. Because as I remember back when I was a student, I was living on less than nothing. When you have to borrow money to eat, that's not good. And you start borrowing this stuff. And I remember going to a lecture in a medical school. And on the way, I drove right past the soup kitchen. And all these people were in line to get their free food. And it dawned on me that young doctors, if you compare them to those guys at the soup kitchen line, the soup kitchen line has a higher net worth than all us young doctors did. They are a lot better off financially than most of us were because we are way in the negative. You're going so far in the negative as a student that eventually you're going to get out, you start earning money, and it's going to take you years to just get up to broke, where your worth is nothing because you're so far in the hole. So for medical students, I think budgeting is super important because you have got to keep that negative as low as possible. You don't want to be going away from zero if you don't have to. And your number one concern as far as financial for investing for the future is to not borrow money. So everything you can do to not borrow money is a winner. For every dollar you borrow as a medical student, you're going to have to earn $4 as an attending to pay it back. And that hurts. And so if you will work hard on your budget, you say you don't earn any money, but you do get a loan stipend payment. You collect your money for the loan, and now that's almost like having your paycheck, and you've only got that much to spend. So budgeting is really important for these guys so that they don't end up borrowing more and more and more. An example might be, you think, well, I can just borrow money. Why do I need to put up with having a roommate? I can just borrow a little bit more money, and then I don't have to have a roommate. But their number one job should be to not borrow money. And if getting a roommate means not having to borrow more money, they're going to be so far ahead. Later on, I meet all these doctors that struggle to pay that money back. And they never felt that that was going to be true while they were borrowing it. I would say that budgeting concept for medical students, very important. I kept a budget when I was in medical school, and I still have, I saw it recently, I still have those sheets where I wrote down all my expenses. And I was living on my stipend of $600 a month back then. Work on your budget and keep it accurate.
I can definitely find some commonalities there. I think I was only up to $800 or $900 a month through basic sciences and at least to third year, which was pretty low considering almost all of that was rent. And even with having roommates, and that is a whole headache, but it's worth it to budget later on, is far lower than a lot of my colleagues and classmates were at. And that ability to see where I was at when in comparison other students were not keeping tabs or they're okay with that extra $200 or $300 a month to live on their own, probably don't see how that's going to add up in a couple of years.
I think most of them feel that they will make so much money in the future. And compared to what they're making currently, yeah, they do make so much money in the future. But if they pile $800,000 of debt on there, you basically have an expensive home mortgage and you're homeless. You got no home, but you got the mortgage to pay. And that becomes very difficult to deal with. And I think often we feel that when we look into the future and we think, oh, I'm going to be making so much, this little thing like whether I, borrow enough money for a roommate or not, doesn't seem to matter at that point. And they just don't realize what effect that will have 15 years from now.
Getting a little personal here, but I donated plasma multiple times during my rotations to pay for groceries or gas. I had a secondhand furniture arbitrage, you could say. taking stuff here, fixing it up, because it was the only thing I could do in my spare time while I was still studying and doing clinical rotations. I had plenty of friends that they had newer vehicles, so they could do something like Lyft or Uber. My vehicle was too old and didn't qualify for that. So there's different options out there, but it also is something a lot of students don't want to consider because it's going to take away from their study time. So do you think there's any good way to balance, especially when you can't see the future consequences of this building debt in relation to how much time you're utilizing now? Is there any advice for just avoiding the pitfalls of getting into debt that you could think of?
One of the things that I talk about in my book is Debtabetic neuropathy. And it's a new term that I use for doctors. And by the way, I sold plasma too when I was, I didn't know that was a thing until I was a starving medical student. And I thought, oh, what? They'll pay me just to go sit there and stick my arm out? I'm in, So what happens with Debtabetic neuropathy is if you think back to the time you first borrowed money, it was probably as your freshman year in college, you might have borrowed something. And that first time you were just maybe a little bit scared about, that's a lot of money, the first time you did it. And then by the end of the year, nobody came at you. Some big dude with a bat didn't show up wanting the money back. And you didn't have to make any payments. It was just all deferred till later. So next year, it became even easier to borrow the money. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just throw another batch on the pile. And then the next year, it was easier. And then each year, you're just throwing, I'll just throw some more on the pile. It won't make any difference. It doesn't seem to matter how big the pile gets. I can deal with it later. And so you get this numbness to debt. Debt doesn't mean anything to you anymore. And that's what Debtabetic neuropathy is. Many medical students maybe don't know what neuropathy is. Diabetic neuropathy, which is what this is a play on words for. But that's what diabetics get, numb feet. And then those numb feet, you don't know if you got an injury on your foot. And then the injury can get worse and worse without you noticing it. And pretty soon you could actually lose your leg. Diabetic neuropathy could cost you your leg. And Debtabetic neuropathy can cost you a lot more than that. Some people end up financially in a position where they commit suicide or they have burnout or they get divorced. I mean, it's a very expensive problem. Doing things that remind you to avoid this Debtabetic neuropathy and things like, for instance, we talked about a roommate. You want to have a roommate so you can cut your housing bill in half. But what about things like how you eat? It's super convenient just to pop into the cafeteria at the hospital and get lunch. But if you instead took your lunch is a whole lot less expensive if you made it, and it's probably a whole lot more nutritious. You're going to get quickly walking through the cafeteria and grabbing something fast. So little things like that. Another one is buying a car. You mentioned your car wasn't good enough for an Uber, but there are a lot of medical students who would then say, oh, well, I probably should have a better car. And so I can just borrow more money on my student loans and get a car. Borrow 20 grand and get a car. But the thing is that 20 grand, you're going to have to earn 80 grand to pay it back. Is that car really worth $80,000 to you? If you begin to think in terms of what this is really going to cost me in the long run, then you can begin to think about ways to avoid adding to the debt. So when I was in school, I had a scholarship to Stanford for my undergraduate. And so I got out of Stanford with only $6,000 of debt. And then I went to medical school and the scholarship was over. I had to pay for everything and I had to borrow money to do it. And that first year, when I had to borrow more money, I borrowed in 4 years of college and I saw 4 more years coming down the road. This is going to be a problem. I decided to join the Navy. And I went through the rest of medical school on a naval scholarship so that I didn't keep going in the hole. But I was thinking about it. Had I not been thinking about it, I'd have just kept borrowing the money. And I think medical students just got to think that this money is going to cost me way more than I think it's going to cost me in the long run. And if you just keep that in mind, 4 to 1, you're going to have to earn $4 to pay off every dollar you borrow. Those dollars start getting expensive.
At Med School Coach, we know that getting into medical school is hard. In fact, 60% of pre-meds who apply to medical school don't even get accepted. And if you want to get accepted into a top medical school, It's even harder. It's a complicated process, and even students with great grades and MCAT scores get left out. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for admissions advising. Our advisors are all physicians and former admissions committee members, so they know exactly what medical schools are looking for. One-on-one admissions advising from Med School Coach makes all the difference. Our expert team will help you develop a game plan, prepare your application, edit your essays, and coach you for interviews. Every pre-med has a story, and we'll help you tell it so you can stand out from the crowd. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach admissions advising package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.
And I think there are simpler things you can do with sort of lifestyle modifications and how you look at your personal purchases. Your car, buy something that's quite a few years old, buy it used, pay cash, get something with good mileage. Or your diet, buy and cook your own food. But at this day and age, it's pretty much impossible for most medical students to do anything about their actual student tuition. It's just too much. And the loans, unfortunately, 6-7% for a lot of I forget if it's the private loans or which ones, which that's almost twice as much as the interest rate you're paying for a house. And that doesn't really make sense to a lot of students yet.
When I say you've got to avoid debt, you're trying to do everything you can to keep that number small. Because yes, some medical schools now cost north of $50,000 a year just for tuition. There's no way you're going to not be able to, unless your parents are footing the bill, you're not going to be able to do that without borrowing money. So you are going to be forced to borrow some money. Your job is to keep that number as small as possible. So like you mentioned, going and donating plasma. Every time you donated plasma, if they paid you $20 and that was $20 you didn't have to borrow, that's $80 you're not going to have to earn as an attending to pay it back. So in reality, when you think about one little thing you did, like say a $20 plasma donation, I don't even know what they're paying nowadays, but I think they were paying $20 when I did it. A $20 plasma donation, in reality, you just made $80 tax-free. And so that's the way to think about it. Yes, you're going to have debt. There are some medical students who get through without debt. I helped put my kids through college with no debt. We covered the debt. But if you don't have wealthy family, I didn't come from a wealthy family. My parents, lower middle class, they did not have the money to pay for all that stuff. I had to come up with it through borrowed money. But I was thinking, oh man, I don't want to borrow that much. And so I was looking for ways to keep it down. And then, I found the Navy as one of my options. There are lots of options. Medical students don't do so much that they couldn't have a little part-time job. I had not only the Navy, but I had a part-time job when I was a medical student. And I worked in a job that was designed for medical students. And I was the answering service for a local clinic in the evenings from when they closed at, 5 o'clock until midnight. And then they turned it over to a regular answering service. But between 5 and midnight, they had a medical student man the phones so that if somebody called, I could just reach over and pull out the chart and read information to the doctor that was on call right out of the charts. Because as a medical student, I could do that a lot better than just the service hired. They even brought somebody in. But I actually went right into their office and sat in their chairs and answered the phones up until midnight and was able to help the doctor by looking in charts. And there's not a lot of calls. So as a medical student, basically I got paid to study. And I might get a call an hour and it'd take 5 minutes of my time each hour, but I get paid for the whole hour. And the other 55 minutes, I was studying. And so there's some great opportunities out there for medical students with their eyes open who are looking around, trying to find ways to keep the debt down as best they can. You're unlikely to get it to zero, but the lower you can get it, imagine saving $50,000 over the course of your training. That just saved you $200,000 in practice. So that's a lot of power that you have in avoiding debt.
And that's amazing. The 4X rule that you have there, it makes it feel like less of a sacrifice and more of an investment at that point. every dollar you save being that much more significant later on just probably has a different psychological feeling to it, I would imagine.
It's hard to make an investment and get 4x return on it in 10 years or 15 years. That's a really, really, really good return. So the best return on investment any medical student can make is anything they did that prevented them from borrowing a dollar. There is no place they could have put that money to have earned that kind of return in such a short period of time. So yeah, it is like an investment, and because it is an investment.
Well, then I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I know that some other physician financial blogs, podcasts, you're familiar with The White Coat Investor. I believe you've been on that show in the past, and some of the other very popular ones seem to advise, for the most part, going to the cheapest school you can find, because that amount of debt that you're saving, putting on yourself, like you said, with 4x, that could be quite significant. Do you also recommend something along those lines, or how do you approach the choice of the school based on the tuition?
I would second what they say, yes, because you do have a choice. For example, I had two choices when I went to college. I can take this, my own example. I applied to my state school, Oregon State University, and I applied to Stanford. Okay. And as time went by in the process, I began to realize there's no way I can afford to go to Stanford. So I had, during the process, taken it off of the plate. The application was still out there. In my mind, I had said, I'd love to go there, but there's just no way I can afford that. My parents don't have the money. It's way more expensive than Oregon State. So one day, I was coming home from a luncheon meeting that I went to with my mom while we were in school. And we stopped off, got the mail, and there was a letter from Stanford. And I thought, oh, this looks like an acceptance letter. Opened the letter. Yep, I got in. And I tossed the thing onto the table saying, oh, it's too bad they didn't give me $10,000. And I went to school. So PE was the next thing. And I'm all dressed in PE and we're getting ready to play something. And some guy taps me on the shoulder and says, isn't that your mom over there? Most of the guys knew my mom. And so, yeah, that is my mom. And I went over there and she was standing waving the letter and says, you didn't read the letter. You didn't read the letter. And I had been given the scholarship to go to school. And so with the scholarship, now Stanford was cheaper than Oregon State. And I went Stanford. But I was thinking that same line back then. You have two choices. I have Stanford and I have my state school. Both of them are going to get me a bachelor's degree. Both of them are going to get me where I want to be. But one's going to get me there on a lot more expensive route than the other. Do I really need to pick the more expensive one? Am I really going to get my money's worth from the more expensive one? Now, you can forward that to today when I talk to many attendings who have their kids in private school. And I literally have talked to people who have a second grader. They are paying more in tuition than college students pay. And my comment is, do you think your second grader is getting a college level education from that private school? Because they're paying college level numbers. The answer is no, they're not. We need to think about that when you're applying for medical school. If you've got choices, like you have a medical school in your home state, you best be applying to that one. Because if you can get through with $10,000 a year in tuition instead of $50,000 a year in tuition, that's $40,000 times 4 years, $160,000 times 4. You're talking a huge amount of money difference when it comes to what you're going to have to pay back because you went to that school. So choosing a less expensive school when you have choices, I think is a very smart idea. To avoid applying to your own state school is a mistake. Because if you get into it and it's way cheaper at your state than anywhere else, you know what they call the guy who graduates from that school? Doctor. So it doesn't matter what school you're going to go to. There are very, very few people who it will matter if they have a diploma that has a prestigious name on it. And those are usually people who really want to make a career in the research and academic fields. It may make a difference early on, but I can tell you, none of my patients ever cared what school I went to. They cared that their friends liked me and their friends said, you got to go see Dr. Fawcett. He'll fix you up. That's what they cared about. They didn't care that if I paid a lot of money to go to school or if I paid a little money. They just cared that I was a doctor.
And for 99.99% of us, that's what's going to matter. Get your degree, not where you went.
There's very, very few doctors who the place you went to school is going to actually make an influence in your life.
At Med School Coach, we know that matching into the specialty of your choice and the residency program of your dreams has a dramatic impact on your career as a physician. And your USMLE score is the most important acceptance factor of all. That's why more students than ever are turning to Med School Coach for USMLE tutoring. Our tutors are all 260 plus scorers and have been through rigorous training. Plus, the average student who uses Med School Coach tutoring raises their score by 23 to 55 points. There is an enormous amount of material you need to know for Step 1 and Step 2, and Med School Coach can help you be smart about how to study. We'll create a custom program just for you. Then, we'll help you master USMLE concepts where you need help most. You'll raise your USMLE score. We guarantee it. Visit us online at medschoolcoach.com and use offer code PODCAST10 to save 10% up to $400 on a Med School Coach USMLE tutoring package. You can achieve your medical school dreams, and Med School Coach can help.
Well, this has been some great information so far. Do you have any other bits of information regarding the student debt that you feel would be vital for our audience?
Houses. Let's talk about houses for just a second. A lot of medical students are married and their spouse works. And so they have this thing in America that everyone thinks you got to own a house. So these married medical students are thinking they got to buy a house. If they didn't then, when they go to a residency and they start making money, they think they got to buy a house, got to buy a house. Don't want to waste money on rent, got to buy a house. And I would say, go back to the same thing. The dollars you borrow are going to be very expensive. And medical students and residents have absolutely no business buying a house. I'm just going to make that a hard, fast rule. Do not buy a house. Okay? The reason being, in general, you buy a house because you think it's going to go up in value. But when you buy and sell a house, you have to pay a lot of fees. And it takes on average around 5 years for you to recover those fees based on the way the house goes up in value, the appreciation. And so there are very few residencies that are 5 years or longer. There are very few medical students that go to 5 years or longer medical school. So it's not a good thing. And when you go to leave, you're leaving medical school and heading to your residency, you don't want to have to be trying to sell a house at the same time you're trying to go to your new residency. When you leave your residency and head off to your new attending job, you don't want to be trying to sell a house or at the other end trying to buy a house at the same time you're making all these changes. If you're renting something, and renting is the best short-term alternative, and medical students and residents are someplace for short-term, should be renting. If you're renting, you just turn in the keys and leave. You got a new rental at the place you get there, you just get the keys and you're done. But it's a big process to buy a house. And once you've actually finally settled down, this is the town you're going to live in, and you've been there for a little while, and you've been attending for 2 or 3 years, now's the time to buy a house. And now you'll know what part of town you want to live in. You don't have to be rushed. You can just wait for the one that comes up. And when you finally see the one you want, you'll make the deal, and then you'll just turn in your keys from your rental and you move into the other thing. It is so much nicer. You just got to get it out of your mind that you need to own a house. You do not need to own a house until you've been in attending for 2 or 3 years. That will be the first time you should even be thinking about looking for a house to own. So that would be one huge thing. And the other tip I would give you is to say that treat debt as a problem, not a solution. I think too many medical students see borrowing money is the solution for them. But when attendings have those loans, they see it as a problem. I see attendings and they're having trouble paying these debts off. because back when they were getting the debts, they thought their debt was a solution to a problem. But the reality is the debt is a problem. And you're just postponing the real problem hitting you until later. And when it does, it's going to hit you pretty hard. So keep in mind, debt is not your solution. It is your problem. And you're trying to minimize the effects that that problem will have on you.
That is some great advice. That might be the title for this episode right there.
Debt is not a solution. It is a problem. Yeah. And then read my book, The Doctor's Guide to Eliminating Debt, and it'll help you get your mindset right about how debt is. Debt is a problem, not a solution.
And I was just going to say, we can find these on Amazon, I'm assuming, but you also have financialsuccessmd.com. Is that a good place to find out more information about you and your books and your other works?
I have a blog that comes out twice a week. One time, it's a summary of the 4 or 5 best articles I've read that I'd like to pass on to you, and then an article that I wrote. And sometimes those articles are geared at the young doctor or doctor-to-be, and sometimes at the old doctor. If you've signed up for my blog, you'll get an email showing you that. And then when the title comes through that's not something that pertains to you, you just skip that one and wait for the one that pops up that is good for what you're doing. Because I talk to retired doctors and I talk to doctors who want to be doctors, and they have really different challenges. And so you'll get a little bit of all of that. But the thing that I want to emphasize today is just get your mindset right about debt. And what I like to tell older doctors is you got to stop managing your debt and start eliminating it. I became debt-free about 8 years after I went into practice. And the funny thing is I left residency with only about $5,000 of debt. But 3 years later, I was over $500,000 in debt. Because I saw, oh gosh, I've got all this income now. And so, gosh, everybody would loan me money and I can get all this stuff. And I've been this poor resident all this time. It's time to break free. And I was $500,000 in debt. And so it took me a little while to get all that paid back off. But we became debt free in 2001 when we made our final house payment and have been so ever since. Our personal debt is gone. And so I think just learning that mindset, America doesn't have that mindset. America thinks everything needs to be done on debt. I think you should ask people walking down the street, everyone would tend to answer you that you can't buy a car without a car loan. Cars come with car payments. And when I tell people, no, the car you can afford is the car you can write a check for, they're like stunned. No, cars come with car payments. And as soon as you finish paying the last car payment, you have to get a new car. So you have a car payment. So we have the mindset in America that debt is the way you do things. And we've got to change that. We got to stop managing our debt and start eliminating.
Well, besides the financialsuccessmd.com, is there any other way that you would recommend the audience reach out to you?
I have a Twitter account, FinSuccessMD, and I have my Facebook page, Dr. Cory S. Fawcett and Financial Success MD. I'm on LinkedIn as well. So any of those places are a good place to connect up with me. If you have questions, feel free to email me, drcorysfawcett@gmail.com. We can talk about whatever you need.
Perfect. We'll add those in the show notes of this episode as well. Well, Dr. Cory Fawcett, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks. It was a pleasure.
Each episode of the Prospective Doctor podcast is brought to you by Med School Coach. To access articles, videos, webinars, and free tools to help you succeed on your journey toward medical school and beyond, visit our website, prospectivedoctor.com. We hope you tune in again next time.